Artist to Art. I'm Aaron Jack Line Art, and we're going to be on today with SameSource. So, welcome on. Let's see what happens here today. There we go. Perfect timing. Unable to join. Is that from your phone? That's the question. Are you on your phone? There we go. Always the questions. Always here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I appreciate it. So we'll be on with SameSource in a moment here. So just hold on. Stay a while. Breathe. Grab a drink. Grab some tea. Hey.
Hey.
How you doing?
I'm well. How about you, man?
I'm well. What a beautiful day.
Absolutely. Yeah, on both coasts, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the first big snow here.
And we get no snow here, which I'm happy to have left behind, having had plenty in my youth. So.
Oh yeah? Where are you? Where do you come from?
I was raised in rural Kansas and southeast Kansas. So so the weather can be pretty extreme there, both the summer and the winter. And so I've kind of wimped out and moved to Southern California, where everything's the same all year round, and I don't miss that. So.
Wow. How's that feel? Like always the same weather, always beautiful.
Well, it's not, there's enough here that you can like put on a sweater for a couple of months and, wear shorts for a few other months. So, I mean, it's not exactly the same all year, but I like it. I mean, people love to say bad things about Los Angeles, but if you're complaining about the weather, then you're just a spoiled person. I mean, there's lots to complain about here, but the weather's not part of that. So,
Oh my God, that's cool that you're getting to experience nice weather right now.
Yeah.
So what are you what brings you joy now in this strange time that we're living in?
That's an interesting question. Artistically, 2020 has kind of been a mixed blessing. I mean, I haven't done hardly any new work. Much of my work involves working intimately with models, and a lot of my work involves, sexuality and stuff. And so it just was never practical to try to shoot stuff with social distancing. So I've just chosen not to do a lot of that stuff until we get past the COVID thing. But I've gone back through like 15 years of work, and I'm a much better editor I am today than I was 15 years ago of my work, and I've found things that were culls from earlier series, and I went through and said, oh, this is something interesting. And so I've been putting together a couple of books that I probably wouldn't have devoted the time to review and revisit a lot of the old raw files from years and years of work, and far too many photographs to count. And this has given me a real time to examine that. And I guess that's given me some joy and some pleasure to have a better perspective on the work that I've done, and to actually feel that a lot of it has been better utilized now because of that.
Wow. So did you have the ideas for the books beforehand, or how did you come to the making the books?
Yeah, I suppose whenever, fine art photography is kind of something that you're by the whole the beast that is the gallery process, the relationships you have with galleries, the relationships you have with collectors. When you're taking pictures of things and selling them for what's really hefty prices, then you want to be able to have an opportunity, I think, as an artist to intellectually put that in context. And a lot of collectors really like the idea if they own a piece from this series, they want to be able to see the whole series, and it validates that experience. So there's a lot of good business reasons to even consider that from the start, to be perfectly honest and pragmatic about it. But also I come from it from a perspective as a writer. I worked in film and television industry for many years, and as a writer mainly, in addition to some other things. And so that's something that's kind of in my wheelhouse. I'm not afraid of that. And so some of the books that I've done, there's quite a bit of writing. Like the most recent book that I did on my Reinterpreted series, it's it's over 50% writing. So it's not just a book of photos without any description kind of thing. And so for me, that was for a series like that, where it was steeped in history and I was trying to kind of rework historically famous paintings. I wanted to give it that context. And so I would say that a lot of times the idea of a book is built into the idea of any series that I would choose to pursue. The book then, of course, manifests itself in a manner that tries to service the work, not, you know, to be the primary focus. But yeah, I mean, I think that answers your question. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like the work really, like for you, it lives on the walls, and then the book is kind of the explanation and the being behind it.
Right.
I mean, I'm, you know, what it is. What is it?
Sure, absolutely. And you know, you know that a certain percentage of the people that you engage with as an artist are never going to see your work in a gallery, and some of them are only going to see it online. And as a photographer, that's very limiting, because it's really actually affected my work, because the life of an Instagram fine art photographer, it kind of pushes you toward shallow depth of field, very content centric, subject matter front and center kind of work, because that is a much more accessible on a phone or even on a computer screen. A lot of my earlier work and earlier series, I was very focused on panoramic, wide, long depth of field, very wide lenses, very, very sharp tack focus that goes very deep into photos, and tried to have multiple layers of engagement. That stuff just does not work as well on a computer screen or a phone screen. And a book, at least if it's a coffee tabletop type book, 12 by 12, you know, 12 by 12 type format, it has a better opportunity to engage with people. So for some of my earlier series, especially, I feel like the book is an alternative to seeing the stuff, you know, in a computerized format. And so that was very important for me. But even with the later work, which often has been more computer friendly, I think by design, you still want to create opportunities for people to see the work in more of a way that you would like. And I think, if you as an artist just, you know, take a rather, you know, strident perspective and say everybody's got to see it in the gallery or they're not going to experience it, then you're missing the opportunity to interact with people. And I think part of the reason we do this is to have the human interaction, to have the, you know, the expression, to be able to experience what people are experiencing of your work. I mean, it's a tremendously egocentric process as an artist. And so you want to enable other people to take some meaning out of what you're doing, or what's the point, you know?
So how do you find that process between like the creation and then and finding your own meaning, as well as allowing others to take their meanings from the work?
You know, I don't worry about dictating what their meaning is, and I don't worry about if necessarily they're going to come away with the same message I intended. I think, you know, I've offended people with my work occasionally, and I kind of feel like as an artist, if you're not offending somebody somewhere, then you're probably not pushing yourself, you know, hard enough. But I came at it from the standpoint of, you know, my personal satisfaction is if there's ever any case where anyone else is moved in a positive way or experiences my work in a positive way, that it's kind of like a payback to the world for all the wonderful art that I've experienced as a viewer and as an audience, and, you know, in all media. And to me, that is the hope, is that you generate something that actually has some value for somebody in some way. And so in terms of when I start a series, I always have a very defined idea of why I'm doing this, what makes sense about it, and what the message is that I'm trying to accomplish. But I don't think that's a dictatorial point of view that's saying that's what you have to experience as the viewer. I think it's just saying, this is my creative expression. I'm going to throw it out there. And if you come back with something completely different, all the better. I mean, that's an interesting thing for me too.
How do you find that between like your writing? Like, do you find yourself writing, like what perspective do you find yourself writing about it from while still leaving it open to the viewer? Or have you experimented with that, like coming from a writing background?
That's an interesting question. I mean, writing is obviously directly literal. I mean, that's words on the page. You're communicating. You can be flowery and metaphorical and things like that, but it is something where the communication is much more direct as opposed to an image that somebody is processing. And so if you look at the things I've done when I have written about my own work, I try to frame it from what motivated me to do this in the first place and try to give people some perspective on what I was trying to accomplish, instead of trying to say, this is exactly what's, the end result here, and to leave it open for somebody. I also have I'm a recovering musician, as they say. I have a past where I spent a little bit of my life, trying to be a rock star. And it's similar when you're writing music that if you write lyrics to something, somebody might find completely different meaning. And everybody's had a pop song where you find out later on that this guy was talking about his argument with his mom, and you thought it was like some kind of meaningful thing about his existential crisis or something. And I think you, as an artist, you never want to dictate to somebody what it is that is valid in terms of their experience. I mean, if they're having any kind of experience at all, then you've accomplished something. So that's really cool. And if if somebody comes away with a meaning that is very different from what I intended, that's still much more interesting to me than if it just doesn't affect anybody. And if my work was consistently not generating anybody's interest in terms of effect, then I'd say, well, maybe this isn't my thing, and I move on to something else. So
Cool. So how's that going from your recovering musicianship? Are you still playing a little bit? Does it affect your work now?
no. I'm out. I'm completely out, man. I did my life along those roads and things, and yeah, it's kind of, to me, it's like an obsession. I have to either be all in or all out. I mean, I was at the point in my life at one time where I was practicing 4 hours a day on piano just to stay at the level that I was, and I just said, I don't want to do this anymore. So it didn't go the direction that it needed to go, or I needed a different phase of my life, so I moved on to other things. So I would say, I am educated, as a musician in terms of schooling and things like that, and that informs me culturally, it informs me historically. Understanding art in any genre and its historical context, I think, is so important. That's something that we don't do a very good job of teaching. Like, the fact that Mozart and who's going to try and Benjamin. I'm blocking the name of one of the founders of this country. The guy who went to France.
You can name it in the comments.
It doesn't matter. Thomas Jefferson and Beethoven were contemporaries, and were affected by the works of one another and those kind of things. And I think that as somebody who has a background in both art education and music education, those definitely affect me as a fine art photographer in terms of a cultural awareness, and as a writer in terms of understanding context and history. I think those things are so important in terms of having something to offer yourself, to understand the great thinkers in different things and why they thought what they thought and why they produced what they produced is tremendously influential. But I don't think that, I mean, some people have argued that there's a musical perspective to some of my work as a photographer, but that's for them to say. I don't know.
That's totally fair. That's interesting. So, who are some people that you're contemporarily influenced by? Since you're talking about like the and like the
Sure.
thought.
Yeah. I just noticed that Betsy in the
Yeah,
comments said my
Betsy's
hair salon.
here,
Yes,
and
this is my
we've
COVID
got.
hair, Betsy. This is I'm returning to the. I had hair down to like half down to the back of my back at one point when I was being the rock dude 25 years ago. So yeah, this is my COVID hair, and it is what it is. You're gonna have to just deal with it. But
I understand.
yeah, no, I actually Betsy's a good example of somebody whose work is completely different from mine, but I've found her tremendously valuable to have as a colleague. And there, I mean, she does acrylic work, and most of her recent work has been these. Well, you know, you've had her on our show for
I
viewers
have.
of your
You
channel.
can see a
Yeah,
previous
yeah,
episode
exactly. So go
with
watch her
Betsy.
show. I mean, she makes these kind
Hmm.
of like popsicles and suckers and things like that that are acrylic that are these really fun, you know, playful expressions. And you know, there's very on the surface, there's very little with of that in some of my work. But then again, at the same time, I did a series, which one of the series we might talk about later today, which I call the Underside, which was um, a vintage photography gear, like a 1960 perspective on a nude pool party kind of a thing, and it's way oversaturated with colors, and it's kind of like my idea of kind of a Betsy Enzenberger, you know, flavor in my work, because the colors, you know, are what just knock you out when you first see her work. And so that's an example of somebody that I'm involved with. I mean, you know, there are a lot of famous fine art photographers today, and I could give you a list of them that I think are cool, and I looked at their books. And certainly, people from the last 100 years, all the way back to the beginning of photography, there's quite a few. But I'd be more interested in talking about contemporary artists that I know and are kind of in a little, you know, cabal of Los Angeles artists that I've had the good fortune to kind of meld into here. Um, and that for me has been a very rewarding process as an artist. They're not necessarily people whose work is in the same genre even, but are people who influence me. And, you know, I always like to throw a nod to Steve Getty, who when I first started showing professionally, he it kind of mentored me in that, took me under his wing and talked to me a lot. And I see him, you know, in the before time, you know, before 2020. I would run into him like 3 times a month. He's a guy who goes to like every interesting exhibit in town. There's a handful of other people that are photography enthusiasts, you know, that I would see all the time. I mean, Eric Min Svensson and Carl Shubs are friends of mine, and they're Carl's in particular is every time there's any kind of award for street photography anywhere in the United States lately, it seems Carl seems to be recognized, and he's masterful in that. And you know, Carl and I kind of have a running joke back and forth with each other that, and whenever he posts on any social media, he always says there's no Photoshop used in any of my work, kind of a thing. And I always give him grief about this because my work is, you know, very Photoshop driven. I see it as part of the tools in the chest, and so that doesn't invalidate his process. Don't misunderstand me, but we have very different techniques, and yet he is extremely good at seeing composition, and I value that as somebody who has, you know, has studied art history and has tried to incorporate that into my work. I'll see Carl's work, and it'll be, you know, some people hanging out on a street, but he'll capture a point of view that that almost no one else would see, and he is great at manipulating our perspective with his lens, which I think is a good thing because that gives you the artistic point of view. And so things like that, you know, my work on the surface has very little in common with his again, but I'm influenced by his skill and his talent in terms of composition. It makes me reconsider what I'm doing. So,
Let's check out some of your work. We can maybe see it a little bit better there.
all right, cool. All right, yeah. So this is from the Reinterpreted series. I think I gave you 4 or 5 of those to look at, and roughly in French, this is this is a very literally titled piece, like a nude woman turned to the right. I actually flipped it and turned to the left here. Some of these are probably more interesting if you look up the original work so you can see the perspective. And in the book that I did, I included the original work so you can see them both. This is in the Orsay in Paris. And for this series, what I did was I went around to the original museums, got permission, and did a high-resolution photo of the original work. And these are all famous nude paintings throughout history. And they date from the middle 1400s all the way to contemporary. And in them, if you look at that period, it's almost all just a bunch of lovely white women, in the Western tradition of art, kind of thing. And so I tried to, for the series, reinterpret these famous paintings that were influential to me and interesting to me and meaningful to me with contemporary ideas about beauty, gender, ethnicity, body, sexuality, sexual expression. And in this case, this is a model by the name of Tara Una, who is an amputee. And in addition to being kind of an alternative looking, young lady with a lot of tattoos and things like that. And most of the photos in this body of work, I started with a photo and then looked for a model to fit it. But in this particular case, I had an existing relationship with her and I wanted to include her in the work. And I went and found a piece that I thought was very conducive to showing her. And this piece is all about the arm in the original. And in her case, it's not there. And so for the technique, I've incorporated elements of the original, of my photograph of the original painting and my photograph of the model. And, it was a painstaking process. The models had to be really patient because I'm trying to basically recreate lighting that exists in a painting with lenses that match the perspective that the painter, adapted, which the earlier you go in history, obviously that becomes more and more difficult as perspective becomes looser and things along those lines. But I ended up having a lot of 19th century French artists because they kind of really nailed that from my point of view. And in this Denis piece, it was so much this lovely flow of curve of the arm that I thought it would be an interesting thing to kind of switch that out and have all that loveliness there with a different body type and without the arm kind of a thing. So this is an interesting painting, the original, because it's probably a Nicolas Poussin painting, but there's some art historians who now debate who the actual original artist is. But it's based on the Greek fable about basically this woman who has sex with a swan and that produces Cupid and some of the, it's a long convoluted story, but what's the official title of this? I'm going to cheat here, and it's been months since I've actually looked at the language here. Leda, my French is so terrible, but it's Leda and the Swan, basically, is the English version of that. And this is at the Condé Museum in Chantilly, France. And, again, in this one, here's, in the original, you have a very innocent woman who is being, I think, kind of overcome by Zeus, who has taken the form of a swan and is deciding to impregnate her because these weird bestiality themes, I guess, are okay for us to show in the 1700s if we do it in the form of a Greek myth. I mean, so there's all kinds of weird fetishism that appears in nude art, but only under the guise of religion or mythology. And that to me was always fascinating because people couldn't talk about these subjects, but they as somebody's sexual proclivity, but they could discuss it as something that happened in mythology or religion. In this particular case, this model, Eon, is the name she works under, and I wanted to get somebody who, instead of being kind of overwhelmed by the swan, was kind of giving it right back to him and taking it on and being very overtly aggressive in her posture and her point of view. And there's an element of humor here and also an element of direct confrontation in the work. And so if you see the original, the positioning is almost exactly the same, but what I tried to accomplish here is that the attitude is completely different. And, the model certainly brought a lot to the table in that respect. So this one, it's a little tight on the cropping there. There you go. And this is a Gabriel Ferrier painting that's also in the Orsay that is another example of where a really dark, sexually dark topic is only kind of allowed to be part of polite company in this painting because it was couched in a discussion of the Spanish Inquisition. So here's Ferrier, in the 19th century, or no, 18th century, and he's basically has painted a picture of a maiden in distress who's being accused of being a witch, and so she's being tied up by some men and burned to the stake. And so my flip on this was to give you a Me Too kind of a thing, a hashtag Me Too kind of a thing, where you've got three kind of dominatrices in latex who are taking a young man and tying him up and burning him to the stake. So, you know, if you look at the original painting, it's kind of a fetishized bondage and snuff sex painting from, that period, which is really dark, landscape to discuss. And none of the contemporary reviewers mentioned either any of those terms or any of that discussion. They just talk about a little bit about the Spanish Inquisition and then focus entirely on the technique and not the content of it. And to me, that's interesting because these things were always part of people's sexuality, and they're always curious about them. And I don't think that just exploring our darker impulses intellectually and artistically are necessarily unhealthy. I think that's a part of understanding ourselves. To be clear, I'm not advocating that anyone be burned at the stake or that's a cool thing. Regardless of gender, I'm just saying that the fact that people sometimes find that sexually charged is an interesting thing for examination. And so, flipping that and turning the gender was kind of the path I decided to go on that one. So this is probably the most famous, certainly of the ones that I gave you, or it's one of two that's very famous. So this is Manet's Olympia, which most people would recognize the original where there's a white woman and then there's a black servant woman bringing her flowers. A lot of people who view this today lose the context of it. I mean, this was one of the reasons this was such a significant painting is that the subject in the original painting is looking directly at the viewer and confronting the viewer with her nudity. And she's meant to represent a sex worker. And that is a topic that this painting caused a lot of outrage in France when it came out in the 19th century. And part of it was because nudity had been common in 1,000 years of art tradition by then in the Western tradition, but it was usually branded as this idyllic, chaste, kind of purity, or in some kind of religious iconography. And Manet comes along and he paints a sex worker who is receiving some flowers from presumably a client, and just directly confronts you with her raw sexuality and her raw nudity. And when people come up to this today without the historical context of that, or being shocked by that, a lot of times what we see with 21st century eyes is there's this really dark African black woman and a white woman sitting there, and we see it in racial terms, which I think was not really the point of view that it was probably experienced in the 19th century. And so that for me became the interesting thing to flip, was to have the person of African heritage be the subject, and then to have a Caucasian person bringing her the flowers, kind of a thing. So. And this is the Rokeby Venus by Velázquez, the original one. And again, it's something that it's a very famous new painting. And I wanted to give us a little bit different perspective on it. One of the interesting elements about the original was that the model in the painting is looking at herself in a mirror, and the the eyes were set up so that she's looking at you through the painting or through the mirror. And so that was again considered very confrontational. This was a painting that was barred from public view for decades after it was first painted. It has a very interesting history. You should look up Rokeby Venus. And certainly it's every famous art, every artist who was working in nude art past the middle 19th century is influenced by this painting. It's one of the most important of all time. And to me, I thought an interesting 21st century interpretation of that is I brought a model. She's like platinum blonde with her tattoos. And so, and in an age where we're constantly doing selfies and interested in Instagram and things like that, she's not looking at us through the mirror. She's looking at herself. And so the obsession in the 21st century of everybody, hey, look at me, a picture of me, I'm looking at myself. And it's not about, experiencing something with somebody else, but about seeing yourself in your own image constantly. And so that was kind of the idea going into my reworking of that.
Wow. So you seem to have like a very strong concept of the what this is in the 21st century of looking at the self and the seeing the other. What's informed your opinion of that and like the that like look in the mirror, and it seems like a very interesting idea that you have there, like the looking at the self in the mirror versus looking at the viewer.
Well, when I first started this project, this series, and this series took like 6-7 years to actually execute, kind of a thing, because not the least of which was because I had to travel to these museums, most of which were in Europe, to actually photograph the originals, because I wanted the purity, that process of my own photograph of the original, and then incorporating my work into that photograph. And and so the selection process was, I started with several hundred photographs that I thought were interesting, or several hundred photographs of famous paintings that I thought were interesting through art books and things that I'd studied way back in college and in subsequent years, that I've always been very interested in sexual expression in art. And the nude art painting is full of all kinds of contradictions historically and very interesting traditions as well that fascinated me. And so I wanted to pick the things that I thought were seminal, both in my development as an artist and also in development of the genre. And in many cases, there are many famous ones I didn't pick, but the ones that I did pick, I I didn't pick them unless I thought there was something that I could do that was an interesting reinterpretation of it, that would have some kind of contemporary context or some further ground for discussion. I mean, I like to refer this to this series as my involuntary collaboration with some of the most famous artists of history. So they didn't really have any say about that. So at least out of respect to them, their works were so important. I wanted to at least be able to offer something different instead of just trying to copy them with a current model, kind of a thing. And so I would say that the original works and my understanding of them, as for right or for wrong, informed the choices I made. And I would look for elements in the original works that I thought might have a different perspective if they were done in 2020 or in the 2010s when I was doing a lot of these. Okay, now we're jumping to, and I put this one in social media to pimp this yesterday, so it was the first time I'd actually exposed that one. So this is, I've done a long series of mid-century modern kind of retro lingerie and architecture and art design and interior design, mixing those things together. I have a particular love or fascination for late 50s through up into the early 70s maybe, of that period, which is very high style, high concept with the mid-century look. And this is, a lot of this was a collaboration with a retro lingerie company based in London called What Katie Did, which does period accurate and pricey and nice fancy lingerie from that period. And I'm using contemporary models, contemporary bodies in many cases, but that's less of the focus as it is with the reinterpreted stuff. And I just wanted to offer my photographic high style, often noir, high key, in some cases, in other cases, very high contrast perspective, and a tribute to some of the great photographers that work in black and white, and trying to use the full tonal range of the lightest light to the darkest dark within the same photograph, capturing nice perspectives and point of view. And these photographs are painstakingly lit and time consuming, so the models had to be really patient, and there was that. And a lot of them are shot in Palm Springs, which is kind of a, if you don't know Palm Springs, being an East Coast guy, you may never have been there. It's the best preserved, at least on the West Coast area, for mid-century modern architecture and art and design, and there's a lot of tradition there from, there are places that could pass for 1959, 1960, just walking into them, kind of a thing. And so I'm kind of fascinated with the high style of that period, and these works are kind of in the tradition of that. Just
but we will see what
not
happens.
Much more to that. Just hopefully it's fun in that perspective.
Out, come back.
Did I lose you?
Take them off, bring them back, see what happens. It says unable to join. Oh, there we go. You can see it full now. There you go.
I guess I got lost at some point. I don't know how much of that you heard. A little circle came up, and I was
the circle came up, and we had our tea break, and now we're back. And
well, I don't know how much of you heard, but essentially it's a series where I'm working in black and white, focusing on mid-century modern architecture, art design, and I think you heard what I said about the lingerie.
We heard what you set up until you were talking about like the Ansel Adams idea of like the darkest dark to the whitest white, the 10,
right. Yeah. And I think, I went to film school as like a director at USC years ago, and I had a great cinematography professor who would drive these ideas into me, and he said, shoot everything on your camera in black and white until you really understand tonal range, and make tonal range part of your composition. And this series definitely is trying to honor that. And at the same token, he also told me never use color unless you have a reason for using color. So and so this is definitely a kind of a tribute to that education and that tradition. And much of it's shot in Palm Springs, which is in many areas of Palm Springs, it's a time capsule of 1960 and high mid-century modern architecture, design, art, and so it's a very fertile ground for people who live and work in Southern California if they want to shoot this period, which I am in love with stylistically and find very interesting stylistically.
There's a lot of history there in Palm Springs, like all the people from film going there, and I learned about it because I had a gallery owner, Rubine Red Gallery was part of this, so it's interesting. I learned a lot through these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely, and Palm Springs is for me kind of, it's a couple hours away, a few hours away from where I live. I live near the water in Los Angeles, but I've gone there to shoot many times just because it's such fertile ground for this particular style. So this is of the same ilk, of the same series, of the mid-century modern retro series, and I call this one Trumped, and I'll let you kind of figure out where I'm going with on that. So hopefully it's obvious, but kind of injecting some contemporary humor into something that has that period. So this work, can you reduce it down? There you go. So this work is, I call it Otto Woman, instead of Ottoman kind of a thing. And this is actually an exhibition right now. This is part of the Los Angeles Center of Photography's fine art exhibition that's happening right now. One of 3 works that I have there. And it's an annual thing there. And I was really pleased to be part of that. And, again, it's kind of sexually charged. And, I find that kind of sexual attitude to be fun and interesting and fertile ground as a photographer. And there's fetishism and also still the high mid-century look and hopefully good contrast and dynamics within the photo. Same kind of thing here. I mean, you know, I started this photo with really wanting to capture the shot and thinking about how do I do this without blowing out that window, which is actually facing the sun. So I actually screened it on the outside to make it a little less hot. But I wanted to have, you know, I put the model in very dark tones, and it's a model who's actually an Asian model, so she's got kind of a neutral middle tone to her skin. And I thought the neutral tones of her skin, and it's the very dark lingerie, it's the light to the right of her, and then the set dressing with the, you know, the retro radio from the 50s and things along those lines. But again, it was kind of something that was motivated by what was available in terms of this house I was renting to do the shoot and the lingerie that was available, and then trying to determine dynamic range as a starting point in terms of then composing a shot and building that up and trying to create some flow in it. So.
Wow, so you're really making this from the beginning to the end in terms of like renting out the space and doing.
Yeah. I recently juried a photography contest that was done by a group called LA Photo Curator out here, and I was able to pick the topic, and the topic I picked was no happy accidents, because in the, you know, I'm old enough to have been educated in the analog tradition of photography, but I do shoot digitally now because it's the best tools available for me. But
I'm right there with you.
yeah. So the thing about digital photography, though, for I think a lot of people who start with digital photography, that it's tempting to get in the habit to just shoot as many shots as you can, and then just eventually luck out. If you shoot 3,000 shots, you're going to luck into the best one or luck into the best shot. And, you know, I'm not immune to that. I've lucked into shots myself, but my work in general, my fine art photography in general tends to be extremely deliberate, which can be very frustrating if you spend days setting up a shot and then you never get it. And that's happened to me. You know, I've had things where I've had a vision for something and I've spent days, you know, plotting it, and it was a natural lit shot, so the sun had to be in a certain place and weather had to do certain things, and my execution had to involve certain things, and then it either didn't turn out, weather didn't cooperate, or I didn't accomplish what I needed to accomplish because I misunderstood something about something. You know, there's lots of things where, you know, didn't work with the model, whatever. But generally, yeah, the stuff that I have and the stuff that you see of mine, you might like it, you might hate it, but it's not something that I accidentally did. It's something that was very deliberate generally.
Well, what got you to the idea of really working in such a deliberate way with your photography?
Well, probably just because I'm a control freak, right? I mean, you know, I think as a photographer coming from a tradition of a filmmaker, you know, I went to film school because of Stanley Kubrick. So, I mean, I have this kind of real strong appreciation for somebody who was controlling every aspect of what you experienced in a film. And I, you know, still to this day think his films are the standard by which all other films should be judged. And he, for better or worse, he's controlling every single component of what's going on. And I think there are levels of depth in that work. You know, to me, a great novel is a novel that when you've read it the third time, you've taken away things that, you know, when the first time you read it 5 years ago, you didn't take away, and you've taken away deeper levels of meaning. And whether that's because you've grown as a person or because you just were unaware of things and needed to process it multiple times to see it, to me, that's the standard by which everyone should aspire as an artist. And so I don't know if I've accomplished that, but to me, the way of accomplishing that is to have as much control and as much forethought into what you're doing as possible, so that you are trying to take advantage of every element that is within your control. So, you know, it's cool if it looks great and it's eye candy, but if there's also something interesting and something happening with shape and design and what you're thinking about, you know, one of the things I often say when I kind of only, it's kind of halfway a joke and halfway serious, is that people ask me what I do for a living, and I say, I provide an intellectual context for rich people to provide dirty pictures, and so there's some sincerity in that, because it's not just rich people, because I have some work that's affordable, but the idea being that I think sexuality is such wonderful fertile ground, because it ties into our prurient nature, but it also is a tremendous ground for artistic expression and intellectual conversation. And I don't want to be afraid of any of those things. And whether it's confrontational or it's just aesthetic, I think it's an interesting area where it can be all of those things.
That's quite a way to describe what you do.
Yeah, hopefully there's some humor maintained in that. So.
Well, I find it humorous, so at the very least.
Gotcha. So I think this is the last that we have from this series of the ones I gave you. Yeah. And to me, I just love this because the models, Jill Marceau is the model to the left, the one who's looking behind her. And she has such a look that works perfectly for that period, and the hair, and for a shoot like this, I've brought in 3 like hair makeup people, and they're working on these models for hours to try to make them immaculate and perfect representations of this period. And she's just a fabulous model who is gives you everything through her eyes and her expression. And it's both these models, in fact, I've worked with the gal on the right, works under the name Rubber Dahlia, and she's also a fabulous model who loves to try anything. But working with them together, and they had a great energy, and just there's a playfulness here, and kind of a confrontational thing that in 1960 this would have been probably a lot more difficult for people to see. So it's today's sexuality and a playfulness that's not that overt, but it is something that probably wouldn't have been taken as a photograph in 1960. And but hopefully preserves all the elements of that style, that lighting, that look, and a tribute to the beauty of that style with a contemporary eye on it.
So how are you going about the process of, like, from the inception of the idea to this finished piece? Like, what's that process like for you?
For a shot like this, the models are collaborators, huge collaborators, and as are the makeup people and the hair people. Ingrid Young, Claire Gunella, Paulo Santos were my crew on this, and they were wonderful. And I had the set, and I had a certain, like the very first shot that you saw, and the shot of the woman with the radio. Those were shots that I pretty much had in my head already, and they're fairly static shots where there's not really much in the way of action happening. But for this last shot, I mean, I'm not gonna ask somebody to do this. Because it involves physical contact between two people, and so I always want to be respectful of boundaries and what they're comfortable with. And this kind of grew out of conversation of what do you guys think would be an interesting expression of these ideas in this time. And then once we had something that I thought really worked, I mean, because part of it is Jewel is just magnificent in this 3/4 shot in terms of as a model, and working with her, and I tried to use that whenever possible in working with her, because she fits the style so perfectly with her strong bone structure and just the look and the huge whites in her eyes. She's got like silent movie eyes that the whites just pop and kind of take over the whole frame in that particular shot. And so those were elements that I kind of tried to incorporate into conversations of what they thought would be an interesting thing to shoot. And that's how this shot came about. So it's very much collaboration in terms of they understood the ideas, they understood what we were trying to accomplish, and we were all working together. In this particular case, we rented this house and we had it for like 3 days, and we worked the whole time. And there's all kinds of stuff from those days. And my shooting is, as I said, very methodical and somewhat slow, but by the time you get wardrobe and makeup and hair, I mean, this is an hours long process to do some of these, several hours process to get these shots set up. And then, I am finicky with the lighting and getting what I want, and they're not fast things. So we try to be very high concept in terms of what we're doing beforehand. So.
Wow. How do you start? Do you start with that concept? Like, what stage do you start to conceive that concept? Like, is it sitting around in your head for years, or what's that? What's that like?
Well, I mean, I didn't go around for years thinking about a shot of a woman feeling up another woman from behind, about how that would be cool. I mean, it's cool for me, but whatever. Um, but the idea of shooting things that were sexually provocative in the mid-century modern style, so paying homage to the lighting, the arts, the interior design, the architecture, the noir, the high contrast black and white photography, and then doing that a lot of times with models that would only exist in today, and sexually charged subjects that would exist today. Those concepts exist before I even start the process of booking models, booking the place, and all those things. And so that is something that percolates for a while. But the execution, you have to have a certain fluidity in terms of your cast of characters, your people helping you, and your cast of characters is also your lenses, your lights, your ability to accomplish things. And so I in a particular setup like this, I've rented props from old Hollywood prop places to try to match the period, and I've the furniture, the props, the lighting, all these things factor into what's going on. And I tend to overdress a set because I want it to be larger than life, a super realistic, hyper realistic version of this period that I'm shooting. And so I would spend a day or two just kind of figuring out what would work in terms of arranging all that stuff and setting all that stuff, and then bringing the models into the process, and we spend time collaborating and talking about those things. So everything has its certain step. I mean, it's useful to me that I come from a producing standpoint or background as well, because I try to be hyper organized, because again, that's something I can control. And so having that experience and knowing that this shot has to happen at this time, so let's backload how much time we have to get at this shot, and the shot itself can be fluid. And of course, when you're shooting digitally, you can, and you don't have limits on how many, you can shoot quite a few versions of it, and you can do different takes. Like this particular thing, we did this exact lighting in like 4 or 5 different poses, and just this is the one that ended up being the one that I thought was most effective. So it's not so rigid that you just have this exact image, kind of a thing. I think I answered your question. I hope
1 second, I have to get something right here.
Okay.
As we
Thank you to everyone who came today. I've seen lots of people joining in the flow, and I assume most of you are regulars viewing Aaron's show here. And so thank you for stopping by and taking a look at what I do. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for being here with us today. I really appreciate it.
My honor. I mean, there's nothing more egocentric than talking about your work, so I'm all up for that.
Well, it's something important, I think, in this day and age. There's a lot of people who are making that aren't necessarily talking about it, and I think that's something that is important to talk about it, and then to provide space for others to talk about it, because we don't need to wait for like somebody else to ask us. We don't need to wait for
Sure.
some big organization
For permission.
each other for permission.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you're facilitating these kind of discussions with artists. I've found them useful in watching your show, and thank you to you for just that, kind of grassroots kind of direct connection with the art world, and facilitating these conversations. It's very, very valuable to the artist, and I think to the viewer too.
Yeah, I find it full of like ideas and resources and inspiration. That's kind of like my whole thing, is that I get inspired by just like talking and listening and questions, and then other people sometimes like ask some questions, and just like being inspired in that way every week. I'm just like, oh, I have new inspiration. I so what what are some maybe at this just I just I'm just curious, like maybe some resources or ideas um that you might have that you'd like to share? Like, do you have any resources out there that you
That
think
people
that
should look.
other artists or photographers or whomever would like to maybe take advantage of off the top of your head?
Well, I would say get involved in your local community, and that's more difficult now with COVID and pandemic and all that kind of stuff. There are certainly online opportunities, but let's be honest, they're not as good. I mean, so I would say, for me, having I've been showing professionally for about a decade, and in that time, the the most rewarding element of all this has been the human relationships. And I've been represented by a few galleries, and that only happened because I developed relationships, with those galleries, and not by just coming in and say, hey, 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 show my work, show my work, show my work, but rather taking interest in what they did and going to every single exhibition they did for 5 years. Obviously that's much more feasible if you are talking about places in your local community. And that's where you have the most, I think, impact as an artist, and that's where you can have the most value in terms of the community you represent and the community you become a part of. And you know, participate. I would say focus local, and then worry about the being involved in shows outside your local community. Maybe a little bit after that. I have shown all over the world, and that's been cool, but it's often not as rewarding as showing in my region. I try and I focus less on showing outside of the galleries where I'm represented and outside of the areas where I'm represented because unless I plan to actually go to that area, like I was able to show in Europe a few times over the last few years, but one of the main reasons I did that was I had the opportunity to go there and participate in that community and make friends in that community, be it Italy or France or just some of the other bulwarks of art tradition there that I had studied in as a younger man. So it was really cool to return as an artist. I mean, that was pretty awesome. But yeah, I would say go out and meet people who are doing work, and not necessarily the same exact kind of work, because a lot of times your best champions and your best colleagues within the art community will be people who aren't your direct competitors in a way. I mean, because they might be more inclined to give you a tip or put you onto something if they don't see you as doing the same exact kind of thing. And if you're doing the same exact kind of thing as somebody else, maybe you should try, finding a different voice for yourself anyway. And my work has bounced between some different series that have some different, looks to them. But that being said, it's I do have a larger kind of general a lane that I tend to stay in. And even so, some of my best friends, as I had said, were people that I've met by getting out, seeing what interesting art shows are there that aren't necessarily things that were my style, but meeting people, the artists who are in them and the artists who just attended them. And there's often like professional groups in Los Angeles, for example. There's the Los Angeles Art Association. There's the Los Angeles Center of Photography. There's a few others. I'm being remiss by not naming everything here, but join those groups. Join those groups. Go to their social things. If you're a person who, unlike me, who finds it difficult to talk about your work, or you're a bit shy, I'll be honest with you, expression is necessary. It's part of the game. And if you are interested in this thing about showing your work to other people, part of that is engaging with them. We don't have the luxury as artists of just saying, okay, here's my work, it's brilliant, you guys figure out what to do with it. It just doesn't happen that way. I mean, every bit of art, from the most famous artist to the most obscure artist, is going to resonate with some people and not with others. I mean, the most famous artists in the world, there are extremely famous artists that I look at their stuff and I don't get it at all, don't like it at all. And but you know, certainly there are ones very famous I love their stuff. And conversely, there are completely unknown artists that I look at their stuff and say this is as good as anything I've ever seen. We as artists, unfortunately, have to champion ourselves and have to be out there to do that. And here we are on Instagram, and that's a tool as part of the process, but I don't even think it's the best tool. I think the most important tool is the human relationship, and that's no different than it was, you know, 500 years ago, or certainly a couple hundred years ago. And forming a community with other artists and art appreciators and collectors cause people to have a human reason and a vested interest in seeing what you've done. And that is the best advice I can give anyone else, is form real human connections with people so that they'll be more apt to be interested in your work.
Real human connections with people. Do you find that as an important aspect of your, so you find that in your work as well as sounds like you find it around your work?
Sure. I mean, not only from what I was talking about earlier, where I'll see something and it might influence my work as a result of, you know, I wouldn't have necessarily known. There's a fabulous photographer who actually does a lot of food related photography, named Eric Stanley, who also does very high fine art nude stuff and a lot of humor work too. But his main commercial thrust has been as an educator and doing commercial food photography. And I was in a show with him, gosh, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago at this point, or something. First time I met him. I've been in a few shows with him over the years. He's a San Francisco-based photographer, and there is painstaking detail in his work. And I see the lighting, I see the execution of composition, but also just the very strong detail in the actual image, and that informed my work. You know, and I probably never would have known about Eric had I not put myself out there to be part of the community, because he's not a tremendously famous artist, extremely talented artist, but you know, he continues to show and do things, and you should look him up. But again, because I became part of the human connection and developed a friendship with him, I have remained very involved in seeing what work he comes out with. And as new work comes out, I'll look at that and say, oh, that's an interesting thing. So there's the front side human connection that influences my work, but also what I was talking about in terms of on set. I mean, every photography, like filmmaking, like anything where you're not just sitting alone in a room by yourself, it is an inescapably collaborative medium. And in that respect, if you're not taking advantage of the human relationships that you have in the room, then you're not reaching the potential of your art. I tend to shoot a lot. I shoot a lot of the same models over the course of my work several times, and I tend to shoot a lot of friends and people within kink communities, within sexually expressive communities. Those are interesting people to me, as opposed to booking famous artists that, you know, are in 100 other people's work and are sitting there looking at their watch to see when they're done, you know, and show up, and they might be great at what they do, and that's cool, and they're collaborative in respect of what they're giving you. But I really love working with other people who have an artistic bent, and they're going to sit down and say, you know, what if we did this, or wouldn't this be cool if I tried this, or wouldn't it be awesome if we explored these things? And sometimes I'll hate what they come up with, you know, and that's just part of the thing. And I'll go ahead and try it anyway, just because I'm saying, well, okay, we'll give it a shot. We'll try your things. And occasionally I'm proven wrong. You know, a lot of times I'm not, but that's okay. That's part of the process. And so the human connection facilitates those things. If I hadn't become friendly with that person and taken an interest in them as a person and finding out what their skill set is, what their life is, you know, what are you up to? What are you doing in life? What makes you you? Then I'm just scratching the surface of what I have in my palette as an artist. I tend to think of the people in, a painter has all these colors and all the richness of the colors, but also has to understand how all those colors can mix together. Otherwise, they're just these primary colors and they're not accomplishing anything. And as a photographer, every element that is your image is one of those colors from your palette. And your job is to not only understand how to best use them, but how they mix together. And if you don't really understand the nuances of your models and what they're capable of, you may not understand the nuances of how they would fit into this lighting scheme or how they would fit into these props or with each other.
Well, that needs to be small.
What's that?
Oh, it's just like the size, like when I go like this.
Yeah. So this is a series. We can go through these a little faster probably for
let's
but this is a series kind of on latex clothing fetishism, which I find a fascinating, interesting expression of sexuality. A person can be dressed head to toe in a latex garment, and some people would find that more scandalous than a string bikini that is barely covering up, naked little parts, kind of a thing, because the material has a sexually charged connotation to it for some people. And I find that fascinating. I find it interesting for the people that are enthusiasts of it, and interesting of how it can fit into the landscape. And so I've shot a lot of people doing it. I've worked with a lot of designers who are artists themselves. This particular photo here is a dress that was designed by a company called Essential Latex, which is a woman named Heidi who works out of St. Albans in the UK, and very talented designer and artist in her own right. And she's kind of got a retro style here with latex clothing. So in some ways, I like to think that she's doing something I'm doing, which is taking classic old styles and incorporating a modern fetishism or a sexual expression that would not have been possible when that style was in vogue, and mixing that with a model today. And again, doing that very single light, high key shot with a noir kind of flavor, to me, tied into that dress, and was kind of, part of the idea there. So this was shot in Iceland on a lava field. The direct translation in Icelandic is that this is wasteland, is what they call it. But it's a big area that's, can't be used for any agricultural purposes, kind of a thing. It's just chunks of blown up, lava field with some moss on it here and there. And this is a Polish model. Oh, no, we moved on. Now, this is some jellyfish that washed up on a beach, and with these models, and the jellyfish have a slimy, glutinous quality. So I thought mixing some models in latex with that would be kind of an interesting look. This is a little bit of a Kubrick nod here. Back behind them and to the left, you see a still from Dr. Strangelove, right before we get to the part where they're talking about how the whole world has gone to hell and they're going to live down in their little essentially man-built caves, and have to create a society down there where, to me, the next step beyond that would be cannibalism. And so taking that to a silly, hyper-realistic thing with these women cannibalizing another woman, which has sexual fetishism again, and has a sexually charged thing, but trying to present it in the context of both humor and direct sexual confrontation. So moving on now, this is the Underside series that I mentioned when we were talking earlier, and I said, there's a little bit of Betsy Enzenberger influence in terms of, this knock you in the face with color. And so the idea here was I had some retro vintage underwater gear, and I was thinking, what if Life magazine shot an underwater nude pool party in 1960, which they wouldn't have done because they wouldn't have shot a nude pool party, but to try to make the colors oversaturated, so you have that almost 3-color bleed print process where everything's hyper realistic and super oversaturated in terms of the colors, and just really giving you eye candy with teasing and playfulness of different shots of this underwater photography. and trying not to do the same things which I've seen in a lot of underwater photography, which is one model just trying to look posed and super cool and elegant, which again, that's cool, not casting aspersions. I'm just trying to do something a little bit different here. So trying to maintain a playful thing of what they're doing and what's going on in, the stylistic thing, and capturing the lighting the way I thought was cool, so that there's more of a hint of nudity. There's some direct confrontational nudity in some of the series, but it was more about incidental nudity than trying to make it a Playboy spread or something along those lines. So, and a few of the shots I actually came up out of the water just a little bit and captured what was going on, just to kind of give you some balance of what's happening. Again, mid-century modern kind of architecture, kind of look, but the models aren't. I mean, they're wearing contemporary sunglasses and doing kind of their own thing. And you can't really tell if there's a swimsuit on them there, but this one you can, because everybody's kind of covering their parts. But, again, the Palm Springs lifestyle kind of look, but with those hyper saturated colors of that are kind of fun and give you a feast of candy for the eye.
Wow. Thank you.
Dude, thank you.
That
Appreciate
was
it.
quite a body of work that you're working on right now.
Yeah, well, it's if you can do it, I recommend it highly. It's fun. So
What are some of your tips for making books of I'm working on some book ideas. So what are some maybe tips for getting into the book thing with photographs?
well, you got to figure out what the purpose is for your book. And in some cases, people are doing a book that's an exhibition, a catalog relatively, or just, a encapsulation of an exhibition they're doing. And that makes sense, kind of a thing as a book. If you're doing the book and you're imagining that most people are going to be seeing the book without the context of an exhibition, that's an important starting point. Those a couple of those shots from the Underside series are in a book that Michael Rokeby just released this week, I believe. That's called California Love, which is all kinds of images of California, and there's many photographers, quite a few of whom are friends of mine that I was pleasure to have the acquaintance of and know. But the work runs all over the gamut in terms of style and genre. But that was a book where he, as editor and curator, came in with a larger overriding theme of expressions of kind of the progressive lifestyle of California, I think is how he would phrase it, or how he did phrase it. And so that's another perfectly valid and interesting point of view. But the most important thing is there needs to be a point of view. I wouldn't say just, a book that's just basically a portfolio of your work of different things doesn't really have much cohesion. And I would say that that's probably not an artistically fertile ground for you to pursue, kind of a thing. But it really let the work dictate the book. And then when you do the book, decide how you want to pursue it. Do you want to work with a publisher? Do you want to do it yourself? Where are your skill sets, and what skill sets can you develop? From my point of view, it's always, if I don't have that skill set, is it something I can acquire without diminishing the work so I can maintain control over it? Because that's part of the artistic process for me. Or is it something that, even with a lot of time and effort, I'm still better off bringing somebody else into the process? And so that's part of the decision making too. And I think that the work will dictate the book, but what you're trying to accomplish as an artist is equally important in terms of how you conceive of the book in the first place. And then at the very least, at the end of the process, when you are nearing the end of the process, bring in some trusted eyes to be an editor. I think as a creator of imagery, we fall in love with our images, and you might want to, you might really like shot A, B, and C, but shot C might be reductive of or duplicative of shots A or B, and you have to make a hard choice there. And bringing an editor in for some additional eyes, even if it's not somebody who's serving formally as an editor, but some other people who work in similar areas that you trust their point of view, or even just an intimate loved one or something who knows very, very familiar with your work and trust that, bring that person into the process and have them give you their perspective on it, and then weed things down to just the most impactful minimum. Because if somebody really loves your work, they're going to go look for other opportunities to experience it, and they'll see that other work. The less is more dictum is probably valuable, and I struggle with that as much as anybody, because I was like, but I have 400 shots of this and it's really cool and I want to show everybody because I worked really hard to get this one and it's really awesome. So that's something you have to deal with, the discipline of that. I have a rule for myself that anytime I've done a series or written anything or done anything artistically, I'll then set it aside for a minimum of like a week, assuming the timeline allows for that, and try to just completely forget about it, and then come back to it and say, I can give this up. I can take this out, and I can weed things through that way. So.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That's a good amount of time. Sometimes I give it a little too much time. So, finding that balance.
Yeah. I mean, the time thing is a relative thing. Like I was saying at the very beginning, I have gone back to shots I took during 2020. I've gone back to shots I took as recently or as early as I think 2006 and reworked some of them. Partly because I didn't know how to crop it or edit it back then to make it as effective as I believe I can now. So you come at it with different eyes, and that can be a useful part of the process too. So don't ever disavail yourself of the opportunity to re-examine your own work, but at the same time, don't let that be a crippling thing. I have a friend, and he'll remain nameless, but if anybody watching is part of our little group, you'll know who I'm talking about, who's been working on his artist website for like a few years, and he has crippling indecisiveness with respect to wanting to be absolutely perfect. Nothing you do is going to be perfect. In fact, an inseparable part of the human artistic expression is the imperfection of it, and that's a valuable part of it. And so embrace your imperfection. Make it the best you can for what it is, but accept that it's not going to be perfect, and finish it on this day and this time. And then if you want to come back to it at some point later in life, that's fine. But don't constantly rethink, what you did for that day, for that time. That's a valid expression.
It's a valid expression of that time, and leave it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And leave it at that moment. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us here on Artist to Art. I'm Aaron Jack Line Art. Artist to Art will be back at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. PST today. So in a little while, we'll be back. And then Thursday, I'll be back on with Freedom Tapestry Project. So check that out Thursday, 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. LA time. So that's Thursdays. Tuesdays, I'm here on Aaron Jack Line Art. So where can people find you?
Pretty much anywhere you see the word SameSource, which is my weird name I work under. SameSourceFineArt.com on the web. SameSource on Facebook. SameSource on Instagram. SameSource Photo on Twitter, and that'll get you there. So thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you everyone who's come. It's really been a pleasure and an opportunity to speak with you today, and good luck to you. I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much. So once again, I'm Aaron Jack. You can find me at Aaron Jack Line Art, and I want to leave people on a note of maybe some words of inspiration and or wisdom from you.
Really, you're going to set me up for this without telling me ahead of time that that you were going to.
It's of the now.
So he throws to me and asks me for inspiration. I guess my line of inspiration would be.
It could be like, it doesn't have to be one line.
Yeah.
It's open.
Okay. All right. Well, I would say, as an artist, never stop trying to do what is meaningful to you. And at the end of the day, that catharsis is the reward in and of itself. The rest of it's just gravy, dude. So experience the fulfillment of your expression. And if nobody else responds to it, you've still had a very interesting journey of going through the process yourself. So So take that and remember that that's why we do this.
Thank you so much. That's why we do this. That's why we do this. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Till the next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.